Megan Rapinoe. And we know her. Ooh, a couple of you? I thought more might, right? She's a world-famous women's soccer player. She helped the U.S. women's team to gold in the 2012 Olympics. 2 World Cup championships in 2015 and 2019. She served as the captain of the women's soccer team, the U.S. women's soccer team, from 2018 to 2020. She's an amazing, fantastic soccer player. She's also known for her political divisiveness as well, and was again in the news this past week. Did you read that? She was playing in her final professional soccer game prior to her retirement when she went down early in the game after tearing her Achilles tendon. Ouch. Yeah. A very frustrating way, right, to end a very storied career. And she gave a news conference after that game, and she said this. She said, I thought about it a little bit, talking about her injury. And I mean, I'm not a religious person or anything. And if there was a God, this is proof that there isn't. This is messed up. She didn't use the word messed, but this is messed up. Contrast that story with the story of this past week when Senator Tim Scott, some of you know him, withdrew from a run at the presidency. Again, an amazing man, started in financial services and insurance, became a city council member in Charleston, South Carolina, then was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives, later appointed to and elected as a U.S. Senator in South Carolina before deciding to run for president. And as it became apparent this week that Tim's numbers were not going to get him elected, I'm sure a very frustrating point in a very storied career, he in his press conference quoted Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And then he said, I think this message is clear for me right now. Here's my question, right? Here's my question. When life does not go as we planned, because we know that life doesn't always go as we planned, right? When life does not go as we planned, do we land closer to Megan Rapinoe or Tim Scott? Ooh, some answers. Some of you are really good at that. All right, so that's good. Good. Because, listen. Feedback. Listen. As we prepare for Thanksgiving this week, I want us to be thinking about how we might prepare in life to give thanks in all circumstances. It's in 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Hopefully you still have that memorized, right? Maybe especially the hard circumstances. And I love your response that you feel like you're landing closer to Tim Scott, but I'll be really honest with you. Not that I go to the polarization, to the place where Megan Rapinoe is, that I would doubt God, but sometimes, and maybe there's a few of you here this morning with me, I can get ticked at God when things don't go the way I planned. And so if you've got it all figured out, maybe just go back to Genesis and start reading, because the sermon's not for you this morning. But if you haven't got that figured out, maybe you want to tune in to chapters 11 and 12 of Nehemiah. Because I think there are some hints for us here that help us to land in a place that we can give thanks in all circumstances, even the really hard ones. And they all rotate around one simple thought, a thought that you've heard from this pulpit before, you'll hear from this pulpit again, and it's this thought. God is always up to something good. Even in the really hard places. So I'm going to invite you to turn to Nehemiah chapters 11 and 12. Yes, 2 chapters this morning. Are you ready for this? This is going to fly, right? Nehemiah 11 and 12. It's pages 406, 407 in your pew Bibles that are in front of you. Maybe you have your own Bibles. That's great. You want to open those. There's all these double things like 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Then there's Ezra, and then there's Nehemiah. Or if you have your electronic device, you can turn there as well. As you turn there, let's think together about where we are in this ongoing story in the book of Nehemiah, right? God's people, at the beginning of Nehemiah, find themselves in a destitute place due to their own disobedience. They've been exiled from their land and their homes and their families. But God is still up to something good. He is faithful to his people. He alerts Nehemiah that the city of Jerusalem is in rubble, but that he is to go back and rebuild the wall, a very important part of rebuilding the nation. And as soon as Nehemiah returns, he sees the hand of God in the miraculous rebuilding of the wall accomplished in 52 days. Yeah, 3 of you now are really impressed by that. By a bunch of people, listen, by a bunch of people that know as much about building a wall as I do, and that's not very much. But we hear in chapter 7, verse 4, that though the temple has been rebuilt in Ezra's day, and now the wall rebuilt in Nehemiah's day, that says that the city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and had no houses been rebuilt. So the people who had returned begin to gather. They hear from the law of God, they confess that they've blown it, and they commit themselves to God to be obedient as they move forward. It is a renewal, a revival of sorts, and again we see that in devastating places. God is still up to something, and he's up to something good. The last phrase of chapter 10 is, "We will not neglect the house of our God." And we might not immediately realize it, but they did. This means that someone has to move back to the city of Jerusalem, which, by the way, is still in rubble. And that leads us to chapter 11. And even more, to see that God is still up to something. He is rebuilding his people out of brokenness. In fact, if you look at the book of Nehemiah, he has rebuilt the wall from brokenness, he has rebuilt their hearts from brokenness, and now he is going to rebuild the city from brokenness. So here we are in Nehemiah chapter 11. And the first thought this morning, first point is this. Let's see what God is doing, right? Let's see what God is doing. But as you look at this first section of Scripture from a bit of a distance, I want to ask you, so if you zoom out a bit, if you open your Bibles like I asked you to, and you look at Nehemiah 11, if you just turn the pages, what do you see in Nehemiah 11? A lot of names. What is it with Nehemiah and all of the names that he puts in here? Right? Like we back in chapter 3, Elijah Bombeck did an amazing job with all the names. Stauffer skipped over a bunch of names in one of the chapters because he didn't want to read them all, and he's going to skip them again today, right? But oh, I'm sorry, Paige. I know there's good stuff in the names. What's in a name? Isn't that Romeo and Juliet? I don't know. Anyway, there's a lot of names. What is up with all the names? For right now, I just want you to think of the importance of the names to those who actually read them, right? So people would have read Nehemiah centuries after, indeed, it was written. And it would have been a hard time, a devastating time. But there's something about, even in the devastating time, going back and seeing your family's name in a really crucial place. My Aunt Lynn has given my family an amazing gift in her love of genealogy. Any genealogy lovers in here today? A couple of you, right? So she prints out these like volumes of stuff, right, of our genealogy. Like, I knew my great-grandparents, but beyond that, that was probably pretty much it. But the reality is now I have like going way back, right? With regard to genealogy. And it's fun, right, is it not, to get into that and to see that and to understand those kinds of things. Well, think about that from the perspective of those who read these words. Again, not too far removed from the time they are written, a people still living in slavery, and even a people probably who have recently not heard from God. But they read this, and they say, oh, but look, great-great-uncle Azaniah, he was there when God was doing his thing, when God was literally doing miracles. And he was a dude. He was operating in faith and a part of a movement that evidenced what? That God loves his people, that God is doing things. And sometimes, and this is the reason for the names, there's just comfort in seeing your name. So why all the names? Because it was a connection to God, doing his thing in rebuilding his people from brokenness. So let's now take a closer look to see who these names are and see what God is doing in the present tense. Paige, I will read the very first 4 verses, right? Okay, thank you. So look at chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. It'll help us understand who are these names without necessarily reading all the names. So here it is, 11:1. Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring out 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of the 10 remained in the other towns. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. These are the chiefs of the province who lived in Jerusalem, but in the towns of Judah, everyone lived on his property in their towns. Israel, the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, and the descendants of Solomon's servants. And then it goes into these names, right? So understand the scene. We've talked about the 50,000 people who have returned to Jerusalem, who have rebuilt the temple, who have rebuilt the wall, and they're rebuilding their lives. Well, all of them are living outside of the city of Jerusalem until this point. Because, why? Well, in chapter 7, verse 4, we understand that the city is in shambles, right? There's no houses there to build. What you would have to do is go back into the city and to start your life over again in rebuilding your houses, your lives. But here in chapter 11, verse 1, the thing that God is doing is beginning to send them in. And the multiple names that are given in chapter 11 are the very brave men who led their families into the city proper. So they've been living on the outskirts of Jerusalem, right? They've rebuilt the wall, and now it's time to move into the city. Who's going to do that? Well, these folks are the ones who did it. How did they choose who was going to do it? It was by lots. Did you see that? That they actually took lots, and 1 out of 10 was selected to go back into the city. Now, let me ask you, do you think that was a great selection day, right? Oh, I hope I get to be the one to give up everything outside of the city and move into the shambles where there's danger and all kinds of craziness, and I have to clear a space and rebuild a house. No, listen, you're going, I don't want to get picked. In fact, I thought maybe I would give a contextual illustration this morning to help you understand how they might have been feeling. As you came in this morning, what if I was to say to you, over the weekend, Covenant Church gained ownership through a tax sale of a house that has been condemned to be destroyed, but we are going to rebuild it. And you go, that's awesome! That's great! And then I took out a big bucket with a bunch of straws in it. And I said, I'm putting everybody's name in the directory on one of these straws. And I'm going to pick one of these straws, and whoever I pick, you get to sell your house in beautiful Hermitage and go to the city, to a condemned house, to rebuild it. Would you all go, oh, I hope he picks me? No, we think it's a great idea until we're the ones that have to go live in the house, right? That is what they're feeling as they cast lots to be taken into the city. But for just a second, maybe just for kicks, I would love for you to see the brilliantness, that's not a word, but I make up words all the time, the brilliantness of this idea of sending people back into the city. I mean, think about it. Strategy for rebuilding a city? Actually, it might not be a bad idea in such a way to rebuild. Sharon? E.V. Hill was the pastor of Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Los Angeles from 1961 till his death in 2003. And E.V. Hill had a mission and a passion that someone from his church would live in every neighborhood in Los Angeles. And so they began to intentionally cast lots, right? All right, Dave Myers, you're going to this city, this neighborhood in LA, and somebody else is going this and this. And so all of a sudden, people are now from his church, Mount Zion, is all over the city. And he tells this story. It's a classic story. He tells the story of one of his parishioners in a certain neighborhood was a bit persistent in trying to invite people to church in his neighborhood all the time. He would serve them, do all kinds of good things for them, but he would always kind of, like, you need to come to church, you need to come to church. So there's a guy in his neighborhood, right, in this parishioner's neighborhood, that finally got fed up with all the pressure to go to church. So he says, I'm moving. So parishioner number one helps him load his moving truck, right? You should visit Mount Zion sometime. It's a really great, hey, I'm out of here, right? And he gets in his truck and moves away. But parishioner number one goes back in, and he looks at the directory and says, oh, he's moving to this neighborhood. Who's there? And so he calls that person and says, hey, there's a moving truck that's going to be pulling into your neighborhood in about 10, 15 minutes. You should go meet this guy. His name is, and I just pass him off to you. So sure enough, this guy pulls in, right? He begins to unload his van, and another guy shows up. He says, here, let me help you. Oh, that's really nice of you. Oh, well, thanks. Hey, you ever heard of Mount Zion Baptist Church? He goes, oh, no, you guys are everywhere. Listen, and as E.V. Hill shares that story, he goes, isn't that the point? That we should be everywhere? To rebuild the city? That's the amazing thing that God is doing in Jerusalem. Out of shambles, he's rebuilding the city. Look here. See what God is doing. As he uses all of these names to intentionally build a city that will build his kingdom. But look at the brilliance of God to inspire them as well. To inspire them in the hard things that he is doing by reminding them of the amazing things, listen, that he has done. So in chapter 11, I would suggest that he's sharing with them the amazing things that he's doing. And in order to encourage them in the hardness of those things, in chapter 12, he encourages them by saying, hey, but look what I have done. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 43, the names in chapter 12 are different than the names of chapter 11. We go from a present tense of what God is doing to a past tense of what God has done. The names are names of all of the people, the heads of families that would have brought their families out of exile back to the area of Jerusalem. It is as if the author, and through the author, the Spirit of God, anticipates kind of a sigh of difficulty of what God is doing by saying, hey, we're going to rebuild Jerusalem. So he switches to the past tense as if to say, hey, the way to trusting God more and what he is doing is to see what he has done. You with me? This list of names are those who left their homes, as if to say, hey, listen, you think it's hard to leave the country and go to the city? Try leaving where you have lived for 40 years in exile and return to a land that has been besieged and destroyed. And yet the purpose is, did you not see that God did amazing things with these people, as if to say, can't we trust that God will do amazing things with us? And again, hear it from the reader's perspective, a century or so later, as this amazing story builds on the ongoing amazing story of God's faithfulness in the face of his people's unfaithfulness. It's not all that different, ladies and gentlemen, with what we should do, can do, this Thursday as we celebrate Thanksgiving, right? Now, we can go back several centuries to when the Puritans made huge sacrifices to come to America. We can even go back, if we want, to Nehemiah and think about what God was up to in bringing his people back to Jerusalem. But in either case, we see what? That God is up to something. And he's up to something good. That God is up to being faithful. Then it's interesting, in verse 27 of chapter 12, see how fast we're going? In verse 27 of chapter 12, the names turns into an event. And that happens really suddenly. Which, if you're a Bible nerd, let me just take a moment to say this about that, right? So, you Bible nerds, I think commentators would agree with me, is that the author here is not trying to be linear in his thinking and telling a story, but he's being thematic in the sense that he's saying, look at all these names, see how God has been faithful. Well, let me remind you of an event that just took place not too long ago in your city of Jerusalem, and it was the dedication of that wall that God just finished. And so here he goes, and he says, listen, I know you remember, it just happened not that long ago, where we had this amazing celebration of the dedication of the wall. Remember, God is faithful. And then he gives us some details about this celebration, which are exquisite. It's so much fun. Look at them. It starts in chapter 12, verse 27, if your Bibles are still open. It says, and at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgiving, and with singing, with cymbals, harps, and electric guitars. Yeah, all right. Liars, right? And so there they are. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the districts surrounding Jerusalem and from the villages of the Netophathites, also from Beth Gilgal and from the region of Geba and Asmaveth, just so you know I can still read some of these names, for the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem. Let me tell you what's happening. Like the Levites, right, would only be used in the temple for 2 weeks at a time, and the rest of the time they would live in their farms outside. But for the dedication of the wall, Nehemiah is calling all the Levites. I like to call the Levites. Be a great name for a band. And in this tense, that's exactly what they were. They were a rockin' praise band. Right? He gathered them all and he said, listen, get together, bring your cymbals, bring your electric guitars, bring your whatever it is you play, right? Bring that. We're going to celebrate the dedication of this wall. So here's the rockin' praise band called the Levites. Look at verse 30. The priests and the Levites purified themselves, and they purified the people and the gates in the wall. You say, how in the heck did they do all that? I have no idea, but it must have been crazy cool, right? I don't know, there's anointing oil flying on the wall, the gates, there's water going, everybody, woohoo, let's go, man. And we're just having fun. They did every gate, they did the entire wall. There's this amazing dedication, this amazing celebration of the reality of what God is doing. Then verse 31, this is great, then I brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall. So this wall is big enough that people can stand on top of the wall, and appointed 2 great choirs. One of them was Covenant's great choir that gave thanks. One went to the south on the wall to the dung gate, hard place to go, and after them went Hoshaniah and half of the leaders of Judah, and Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, and Jeremiah, and certain of the priest's sons with trumpets. Oh good, now we got trumpets. Zechariah, the son of Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, son of Mattaniah, son of Milkiah, son of Zechur, son of Asaph, and his relatives, Shemaiah, Azarel, Milalai, Gilalai, Mai, Nathaniel, Judah, and Hanani, with the musical instruments of David. They brought out the musical instruments of David, the man of God. And Ezra the scribe went before them at the fountain gate. They went up straight before them by the stairs of the city of David, at the ascent of the wall, above the house of David, to the water gate on the east. There's a stinking awesome processional. He took one choir and he said, okay, you all follow me. Because it said the trumpets came, right? And the reality is this great procession on the wall. They're celebrating this reality. But that's not all. Keep reading. The other choir, maybe they were from family life, of those who gave thanks went to the north. And Nehemiah, followed them with half the people on the wall above the tower of the ovens to the broad wall, and above the gate of Ephraim, and by the gate of Yeshana, and by the fish gate, and the tower of Hananel, and the tower of the 100, to the sheep gate. And they came to a halt at the gate of the guard. So both choirs of those who gave thanks stood in the temple that they just rebuilt 60, 70 years ago, and I and half of the officials with me, and the priests Eliakim, Maaseiah, Miniam, Micaiah, Eleniah, Zechariah, Hananiah, with more trumpets, and Maaseiah, Shemaiah, Eleazar, Uzi, Jehonan, Mudekkai, Elam, and Ezer. And the singers sang with Jezariah as their leader. So listen, one procession going one way, another procession going the other way, and they said, we'll meet you at the temple. I need a breath. You get it? I mean, everyone is seeing what God has done. And here Nehemiah is going, do you remember that day? Do you remember that? Do you remember how kicking fun that was? To celebrate. And when we got to the temple and the Levites were already geared up, right? And they were playing and we were singing and all the instruments were playing to celebrate what God had done. And it all leads me to loving verse 43. It says there that they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced. For God had made them rejoice with great joy. Don't hear that as God thundering from the heavens, you should rejoice now. No, the reality is they were seeing what God had done, and they rejoiced. It says the women and the children also rejoiced. That made it better. And then this statement, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Listen, this party was so good. It was reverberating off all the dust of the desert to who knows whom and who knows where, but they knew that Jerusalem was celebrating. And you have to understand, Jerusalem is still in shambles. It's still broken. It's still devastated. But they did realize this, that even in their brokenness, God was up to something. And he was up to something good. Not only was it something that he was doing, but it's something that he has done. The final thought this morning is this, to see how he's doing it. To see what God is doing, to see what God has done, but to see how he's doing it. Nehemiah 12, verses 44 to the end of the chapter, it says, on that day, men were appointed over the storerooms, the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes, to gather into them the portions required by the law for the priests and for the Levites, according to the fields of the towns. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered, and they performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did the singers and the gatekeepers, according to the command of David and his son Solomon. And then he goes back, for long ago in the days of David and Asaph, there were directors of the singing, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. And all Israel in the day of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the daily portions for the singers and the gatekeepers, and they set apart that which was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart that which was for the sons of Aaron. See something. Something here in these verses that we've seen throughout chapters 11 and 12. That God is up to something, because he's always up to something. But the way he is accomplishing what he is doing is through his people. Through his people. This chapter ends talking about the men who were responsible for the things of the temple and the ongoing worship of God, both in the present context as well as the men who did it back in David's day. These chapters are full of names that receive high praise as brave men of valor who go into the city, who led their families out of exile, who built a temple, who built a wall, and are rebuilding a nation. So, does this mean that God needs us to do his good things? It's not rhetorical. Does God need us to do his things? No, listen. He invites us to join him in his things. He's chosen you to be a part of what he is doing. He's chosen Covenant Church, us, to do what he is doing. To doing his thing. It takes us back to an earlier theme in Nehemiah. when I said we need to trust God and we need to work hard. We need to trust God and we need to work hard. Trust God in that He knows what He's doing and that He will empower us, His people, to accomplish His plan. But also, ladies and gentlemen, swing your legs out of bed every morning knowing that you're going to have to work hard out of His power to do your part. I think that's what the Lord is saying in chapters 11 and 12 with all these names. See what God is doing and be inspired by seeing what God has done, because He wants you to be a part of it all. So I leave you with two questions. Two questions. First is this: do we trust God, or do we trust that God is always up to something good? And it's a psalm that recognizes brokenness. I mean, the psalmist is real, right? In verse 4 of Psalm 107, it says that some wandered into the desert. In verse 10, it says some are sitting in darkness in the shadow of death. In verse 17, it says some were fools through their sinful ways. In verse 23, some went down to the sea and ended up in storms. But in every situation of brokenness, the psalmist does not give up hope, but rather gives what? Thanks. Thanks. In fact, the theme of Psalm 107 is, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever." It's a challenge for me. I hope it's a challenge for you to say, can I join with the psalmist in that trust? May it be that as we approach Thanksgiving this week, that this would be more true of us, that we trust that God is always up to something good, even, maybe especially in our brokenness. First question: do you trust that God is always up to something good? Second question is this: are we doing our part in the good that God is doing? Are we doing our part in the good that God is doing? You know, after Megan Rapinoe came out doubting the existence of God this week, it seemed like every Christian in the public sphere was criticizing her. If I was honest, when I mentioned her name this morning, there was almost kind of a verbal groan among some of you who know who she is. But should that be our place? My heart, it's taken some time, but my heart has transferred to a prayer for Megan Rapinoe, not to criticize her. Rather, I hope there is someone close to Megan who has the opportunity to share in her very long-term healing of a torn Achilles tendon, to share with her that it's the times of brokenness that often we see God most clearly. I don't know what you personally think of Megan Rapinoe, but I would hope that a number of us might, even covenant at covenant, to pray for her that in this time of healing, she might actually see God. Instead of doubting His existence because of something horrible that happened, she would become convicted of His existence because in her brokenness, He is at work to heal her, both body and spirit. And it's my hope that we as a people and as a church are working more and more to share with a broken world around us that same hope that we have in God, who has ultimately healed our brokenness through Jesus. What greater news is there to share? More on that next week. But can I offer an encouragement for us as we get set to enter Christmas? Not next week, but the first week in December will be the first week of Advent. Our Advent theme is peace in unexpected places. Peace in unexpected places. And we're putting services together that will be simple, that will be festive, that will be relevant. And you ready for this part? Sermons that will be short. All of you who clap, there's confession afterwards in the back. In doing that. Pray for me, right? But listen, simple, festive, relevant, and short is for one reason. So that you, knowing what God is doing and knowing what God has done, might reach someone in your life who is broken and invite them to come. That they might find peace in an unexpected place between the Buell Club and the library. That they might find peace in this coming Jesus. You have broken people in your lives that need Jesus. My guess, it's a conviction of mine, that most of them have been to church before, but they haven't been to church in a while. You think of one of them? So now I just want to invite you to my church. The pastor promises he'll be short. I told Matthew this week, I wanted to make it sort of a wager that if you didn't start bringing people, I would just preach longer. Maybe that's unfair. But can you hear it? We got to do our part. We got to swing our legs out of bed. Stauffer's got to swing his legs out of bed and begin to do something